日本史学習に最高にもってこいのサイトサムライアーカイブスポッドキャストへようこそ。美しい自然にあふれてる縄文時代から波乱万丈な幕末まで全時代を網羅して日本史の隅から隅まで一緒に語り合いましょう。では早速日本史の世界へ。
Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to the Samurai Archives podcast. This is Chris, and today I talk to Dr. Jesse Workman about tea and philosophy. We look at some tea history, the influence of tea philosophy on Western philosophy, and some of the darker aspects of the mid-20th century relationship between tea and the imperial Japanese government. And at some point I'm planning on doing a comprehensive history of tea in Japan, so I guess you can consider this an appetizer of sorts. And before we get started, I just want to quickly thank our patrons on Patreon. If you'd like to help out the podcast and get access to bonus audio and other things, check out patreon.com/samuraiarchives. Any and all help is always appreciated and helps me make the podcast even better. Okay, let's get started. Okay, and I'm here today with Dr. Jesse Workman, PhD in Ancient Weapons and Hoki Religions. That's my Star Wars reference for the podcast. Don't look for more.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Sure. And in the spirit of this episode on tea, I'm drinking Japanese green tea, and Jesse is drinking Jack Daniel's Tennessee Honey.
Here, maybe the ice cubes will be audible over the microphone.
All right, so the goal today, just to kind of make things clear so that we know what we're doing, basically the goal today is, it's not necessarily to do a deep history of the tea ceremony, although I've been doing a lot of reading and I'm finding it extremely fascinating. So at some point, I think I plan on doing an in-depth history of tea from China to Japan, because it seems super interesting. But in the meantime, we'll probably be focusing on, we'll be doing sort of a big picture overview of tea and philosophy and Zen and some of the history. So we're probably not going to focus too much on one aspect or another, although since Dr. Workman here is a PhD in philosophy, we'll probably spend a lot of time talking philosophy. So I think that's probably a reasonable assumption, although we don't really have a plan in mind. We'll see. So just to give a little background on the history of tea, just so we can kind of get started. This will be a little bit of a background, and then I think later on we'll probably talk more about the specifics. But it seems drinking tea probably started around the 2nd or 3rd century BC in China, obviously for medicinal reasons, because they didn't have any real medicine, so they did what they could with what they had. And tea's been going strong in China ever since. And early on in China, it was connected with Taoism and Buddhism, and as everyone knows, with Zen Buddhism in Japan. So tea seems to have hit Japan around the 8th century AD, although sources kind of differ, and some of them imply that it actually started later. But based on what I was reading, it seemed to start around the 8th century AD, with an actual reliable historical record in Japan that talks about tea, and tells about how Emperor Saga was served tea by a monk, and in return he gave the monk his royal outer robes. So the emperor was basically served, it was essentially a tea ceremony from what we kind of understand. So that might have been the first concept of a tea ceremony, was this monk offering tea to the emperor. But, we don't really know. I didn't look that deeply into it. Again, we're just kind of giving a big overview right now. Although one thing I did find interesting is that, assuming that tea actually did start in Japan in the 8th century, it actually fell out of favor in Japan by the 10th century and actually disappeared completely, more or less dropped off the map, except for minor mentions here and there about medicinal purposes until the Kamakura period. And so basically, although we associate tea with Japan, it dropped out of the culture for 200 or 300 years until it was reintroduced by the monk Eisai, founder of the Rinzai school of Zen in the 12th century. I think the source differences that I was seeing was basically talking about Eisai being the person who originally brought tea to Japan. So some sources make it sound like it came to Japan earlier, then disappeared for a while, and then Eisai, the founder of the Rinzai school, brought it back, or he was the originator of tea in Japan. So
was it not a different method of steeping and blending and all that? Brewing and...
I don't know. It doesn't really say. All I know is that tea either came in the 8th century and then, or the 8th or 9th century, I guess, and then disappeared by the 10th and was gone for a few hundred years, and then Eisai, who traveled in China and got his hands on some tea, brought it back, and there you have it. So, and then there's other monks like Socho, the founder of Mount Hiei's, the Endyakuji. So he apparently brought some tea seeds from China over probably around the same time as Eisai, and planted them on the hills of Mount Hiei. And then until they were probably burned to a crisp by Nobunaga a few hundred years later. So, anyway, I guess the point I'm getting at is that although tea had been around in Japan for a long time, the actual tea ceremony as we know it was popularized by Sen no Rikyu by the way of Oda Nobunaga and then Toyotomi Hideyoshi during the 16th century. So, late 16th century. And looking at Japanese history, it kind of seems that the concept of the tea ceremony was in Japan at least by the end of the 15th century, but it wasn't really popularized until the mid to late Warring States period. And also, actually, you know, as an aside, I found it interesting that when you really look into it, it seems that the tea ceremony was kind of like the medieval Japanese version of golf, because you know these high-powered guys would get together in this leisure activity and they'd talk shop, you know, out of the earshot of everyone else. So that's kind of what you see around the time of Nobunaga.
Interesting.
So the idea of tea and philosophy and these sort of ceremonial get-togethers, you know, goes through Japanese history from that point onward. And we'll get into there's other things like its martial ties with the imperial system and World War II and that sort of thing, which we'll get to eventually. But then there was various books that came about that talked about tea and that kind of introduced the idea of the tea ceremony and the philosophies behind it to the West. For example, the Book of Tea by Okakura Kakuzo, which is probably free online and shouldn't be very difficult to find. It was written, what, in 1913?
I believe it was 1906.
Oh, okay, something like that. Way back in the olden days.
Right.
And,
it's in the public domain.
Yeah, so it's available. And also, so my impression when I was looking through it was that there's a lot of mention of Taoism and Taoist philosophy. So I wasn't sure if that means this book basically focuses on Taoism as the philosophy of tea, or if his book had a Zen focus. It wasn't really clear to me. What did you find about that? What do you think about that?
Well, I speculate that the outer trappings of it are Zen Buddhist, but the core of it is Taoism, as is the core of the development of Zen Buddhism is Taoism anyway. Taoism infused with the Buddhism that came to China in the 4th or 5th century. It was blended with Confucianism and Taoism, and what was called in China Xian Buddhism became Zen Buddhism in the hands of the Japanese. I believe the Rinzai sect was developed because he went over to China and he studied with them for, 10 or 20 years.
Yeah,
Eisai, and he brought back a lot of the scriptures, and they were all basically Xian, Buddhist. And Taoism, there's a saying, God, I'm going to get this wrong. Confucianism is how you live your day-to-day life in China, and Taoism is what you might use for, for healing, for medicine, or for divination, or whatever. And Buddhism is what happens when you die. They in China they blended all three of these faiths so intertwinedly that you almost can't tell where one stops and where the new one begins. And the way this affected Buddhism is the idea of Taoism, where you're simply at one with everything around you and you're so much a part of following the way of heaven. The Tao is the way, or the path. That the idea of illusion, and that all of everything is illusion and everything is nothing. Those Buddhist ideas blend almost seamlessly with the idea of the sage is doing nothing, as you see in the Tao Te Ching. The sage goes about doing nothing, and everything is illusion. Everything is Maya. And so that it almost seemed a natural step, the next step, to create a kind of Buddhism where they had great knowledge of the scriptures. Don't ever let anyone kid you that Zen monks did not know the scripture. They do. It's because they know the scriptures that they can dispense with them and put them aside. They're able to say, these aren't worth anything. What's of value is direct experience of the world, and that all things have Buddha nature, right? That everything, whether it's living or non-living, has some aspect of consciousness, of Buddha nature. even though everything is illusion, at the same time everything has Buddha nature. So it's, I guess, one of those complicated Eastern concepts.
Yeah, this feels very D.T. Suzuki because I read a lot of that in high school, and that sounds very familiar.
He was a scholar of Zen. I don't know what school, but it was he who helped popularize Zen Buddhism in the West. The Buddhism that really took off in the West, for the most part, was Zen. I think the Rinzai school. Although don't quote me on that, I'm not 100% sure. Jack Kerouac, the Beat Poets, all the big writers, the scholars in the 60s were influenced by these ideas. A lot of the core of what the New Agers appropriated for themselves kind of is drawn from these more seemingly free-form Zen Buddhist concepts.
So where do you think someone like Jack Kerouac would have got his hands on some sort of Zen Buddhism? Do you think he was reading D.T. Suzuki?
He was, and I think he was also reading Buddhism in translations and a Buddhist Bible, and in particular a book that's specifically quoted as being in Kerouac's library, Zen for Americans. All of these are in the public domain. A more recent printing of Zen for Americans, of course, you'd have to buy, but the original 1932 or 1938 version of Zen for Americans can be found at the Internet Sacred Text Archive.
Wow, we were able to work Jack Kerouac into a podcast.
Yeah.
Nice. I should footnote this here with I don't know if a lot of people get this or not, but Taoism, or Tao the way, also basically equates to Do in Japanese, as in like Bushido, Karate Do, etc., etc. So it's the same concept.
What Do is Do, the road, the way, the path?
Yeah. Another reading is Michi, which basically just means road in Japanese. Like literally, the road outside is Michi. That's another reading of the Chinese character for Do.
Okay.
Or Dao. And I don't know the correct intonation in Chinese, so...
No, nor I.
I only took one semester of Chinese. Not enough to learn that. That was a long time ago.
I'm coming at this as a student of European continental philosophy, which is a 20th century movement. Phenomenology is kind of a sub-category of continental philosophy, which is the European, the French, your German idealists, your French thinkers, which eventually devolved into what we would call postmodern thought and all of its myriad difficulties. But phenomenology captured my interest because, unlike postmodern thought, phenomenology is relatively uncorrupted, and its basic core is we need to start with the subjective experiences that you or I have in our day-to-day lives, in our bodies, dealing with different objects, aspects of our lives from our own perspective. So there's a kind of a relativity, because my experiences are how I experience them with regard to me. But I think there is a kind of core truth, because it's perspective, my perspective, your perspective, both are of equivalent value. But I couldn't help but notice as I was studying these, and I've seen a few references, both from philosophers, Western and Eastern, who said that the founding father, one of the founding fathers of modern thought in philosophy, was a phenomenologist, a German phenomenologist named Martin Heidegger. Very well known. He's a giant in 20th century thought. He is exceptionally controversial.
And he's a Nazi.
And he was a Nazi, yes, and his Nazism has been the primary marring of his character, and some would say of his thought. I would say of his thought, indeed. However, there's another aspect of all of this that I think goes hand in hand with his Nazism, is the fact that he took and misappropriated from the works of Kakuzo without proper attribution. He drew from other thinkers, Western thinkers, Aristotle, Franz Brentano, who was an Aristotelian scholar of the 19th century, and incidentally, one of the founding fathers of modern psychology, Franz Brentano, influenced Martin Heidegger with a work he wrote called The Meaning of Being in Aristotle. It's very obscure. I haven't been able to find a copy of it in English in the public domain, so I have others of Brentano's works, but that one seems particularly difficult to find. But I saw a few references that said, Heidegger took from the Book of Tea, and one of his major concepts are lifted directly from the Book of Tea, and he never gave attribution to Kakuzo Okukura.
Did he ever cite his other references or his other influences?
He did. He cited many of them, but not Okukura. He cited Aristotle, he cited Brentano, Edmund Husserl, although in the earlier version of his monumental unfinished work, Being and Time, 1927, Heidegger dedicated the work to his teacher and the founder of phenomenology, Edmund Husserl. But in later editions, he removed the dedication. In the 30s, during the Nazi era, Edmund Husserl was, although a Catholic, an assimilated Jew. And so Heidegger dissociated himself from his teacher, and there's controversy about how far Heidegger went to actually discredit and cause Edmund Husserl to lose his position at the Academy at Freiburg. But he did cite many of his sources. Indeed, he did. But he never cited the Book of Tea, and he never cited what may have been an influence crossover from concepts in Zen Buddhism. Not anywhere.
So we can get an idea for the timeline. Was Kakuzo and Heidegger contemporaries?
Heidegger's dates are 1889 to 1976. I don't know Kakuzo's lifespan, but he wrote in the early 1900s. He, like D.T. Suzuki, was one of those Asian of whom there were few, an Asian crossover scholar around the early 20th century, right? Along with who is that other one? McTaggart. There were three or four, and Suzuki and Kakuzo were the primary scholars from Japan. So the Buddhism they were drawing from was Northern Mahayana, and their focus was centered on Japan, not on China, not on other Eastern Asian interpretations of Buddhism, Korea. And there were a few others, and they were writing around that time, early 1910s, 19-teens. I think Heidegger had a copy of the Book of Tea not long after World War I ended that had been translated into German. He did not complete and publish his work, Being in Time, until 1927.
So if there was a German publication of that book, then why didn't everyone around him say, hey, you took that from this book that we all have?
They didn't know, I don't think.
Huh,
I think they didn't know. Because Heidegger was drawing from other sources, too, where he could have said, no, I was drawing from this concept in Aristotle, and this concept in St. Thomas, this concept in Augustine, St. Augustine, and this concept, and this one, and this one, and this one. But the more I read, the more deeply I delve into the Book of Tea, which is a very, very short work, the more I see direct connections. And now, everyone, I guess in Heidegger's defense and in all of our defenses, to a point we all borrow from each other. There is a kind of permeation, I guess you'd call it the zeitgeist, in the air, where there are certain ideas that take hold, and everyone kind of draws from a communal well of ideas, okay? And so one could say, well, Heidegger didn't steal. This is sort of where early 20th century thought was drifting at the time. It was very popular. Buddhism had been translated for well over 100 years in German. The German scholars were in the forefront of translating the Upanishads, the Hindu scriptures, and along with them the Buddhist sutras. And you could say, well, it's a mere coincidence, or the ideas were permeating the air at the time. Okay, that's a given. There are direct, word per word, concepts and descriptions of those concepts that are straight out of the Book of Tea, that are in Heidegger's work, that are unattributed. And it is more than a mere parallel development of thought. It's more than a mere communal drawing from what's in the air at the time. It is word per word, and in fact the concept being in the world, which is a primary element of Heidegger's thought, is in the Book of Tea directly, word per word. In the third section, several paragraphs into it, and it's literal. It's a direct connection.
So,
and he never attributed it.
So, what's the implication for Heidegger or Western thought, or is there any implication at all, or does it even not matter?
I think in the bigger, grander scheme of things, maybe how much it matters is mitigated by the sheer volume of work that's been written and different thinkers all across the board. But I think the implication just demonstrates a further besmirchment, right, of the character of this great thinker.
So not only was he a Nazi, but he was also a thief.
Yes.
A plagiarist.
Exactly. And I think it just further illustrates, however intelligent he might have been, in a way he cheated. And he stole from Eastern thinkers, and that calls into question, along with his association with the Nazi Party, and the speculations on, well, how much of his thought actually is disguised Nazi ideology being projected out into the world. We're all influenced. All those of us in philosophy had to spend at least a full year studying Martin Heidegger in order to get our doctorates. So it questions the foundation of an entire discipline of philosophic inquiry. And the fact that he stole from Kakuzo, it just further throws into a kind of a moral questionable quality of both the man and his thought. It just throws that more deeply into question. If Heidegger's work was compromised by his association with the Nazi Party, then it's not unworthy of mention that the tea ceremony wasn't some innocent and peaceful occupation or pastime, that one of the three schools were directly connected to support, honoring of the emperor, the empire, and by extension, Japanese militarism in World War II.
Yeah, actually, so I did dig up some on that, and I don't really understand how these tea schools actually work, because I'll get into it. So apparently the Senkei school really pushed tea as a national drink or a national sacrament. I'm not really sure the terminology there, but they ended up marrying into the imperial line in the late 19th century, which then tied their tea and the tea ceremony to the imperial court. And eventually during the 30s and 40s, it became, as I saw it termed, a wartime sacrament to, quote, engender a sense of national identity. Although I think, I'm familiar with pictures of kamikaze pilots, drinking a cup of sake before they jump in the airplane, but maybe it was tea, or I'm not really clear on that. But it's pretty interesting because there are, I saw mention of the Senkei school, which I have to assume that means Sen, and the K is family. There's this big academic.
Sen? What's that character of
I don't
Sen?
know. I have no idea.
All right.
So I have to assume that, because I'm seeing references to the Senkei, the Ura Senkei, the Omote Senkei, I have to assume that Sen is the family, because K, I'm assuming, is the family, the tag for family. So the Sen family school, I'm assuming, is what that means, which then means there's also the Ura Sen family, the Omote Sen family, I guess. It's not clear to me. This is real weird, abstract, esoteric stuff that I'm dealing with. So
Kakuzo never made clear what the three schools even were.
So you have the Senkei, the Ura Senkei, the Omote Senkei. So I don't know if that means these are different aspects of the same school. Ura in Japanese meaning behind or back, and Omote meaning in the front, or something along those lines. So it's really odd and confusing to me. what this actually means, why there's these three different types of Sen schools. It's not really clear to me, but point being, when tea was tied to the imperial court, it was dedicated to shrine deities, things like that, which made it become considered a divine practice in Japan. And, like I said, resulted in the tea culture being tied to the emperor and the military. And it's actually kind of interesting because you mentioned that it's actually not like a peaceful drink. On that note, back in 2007, November 3rd and November 4th to be exact,
Whoa.
I went to a tea symposium at the University of Hawaii. I went with Joseph, who actually is on early episodes of the podcast. And this was organized by Genshitsu Sen, who is the 15th generation Urasenkei tea master. So Sen being his family name, which makes me assume that this is part of the Senkei. So I'll have to look into this. So if I do my deep history of tea, I will have much better explanation on these different tea families or what exactly is going on. So bear with me. In the case of the tea symposium that we went to, the title of the tea symposium was Fostering Peace Through Tea. So, that at the time, I had made no connection whatsoever to the imperial use of tea during World War II. So I can't help but wonder if it's not a campaign by the Sen family to sweep under the rug or erase, or maybe atone for their association with wartime Japan. I don't really have any way of knowing that. But it was definitely interesting. But yeah, it was a lot of fluff. They're like, we should sit down and have tea with Kim Jong-il or whatever. I don't remember exactly. But, and just as an aside, a lot of our listeners will probably recognize some of the speakers that were there. There was William Wayne Ferris and Paul Varley. And, like I said, at the time I wasn't really aware of the imperial ties and martial ties of the tea school. So long story short, it had martial roots in Japan, or it was used as sort of a propaganda tool in Japan, and now the Sen school is out there trying to sort of
Whitewash
or atone, one
if they
or
were
the other.
atoning for it, doesn't that suggests that they are aware of their culpability and are willing to fess up to it and dissociate from their wrongdoing?
Yeah, and I guess in a way,
which Heidegger also never did. He concealed, and he tried to either hide or make excuses for, skate around his association with the Nazi Party, and he made claims such as, well, I wasn't really a member, everyone was forced to join, I had to do it in order to maintain my position in the university so I could protect the university,
I was
blah,
just
blah,
following
blah.
orders.
That's right. I was just blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
Never mind that and now it's coming to light, and I want to read more about this as I study these things. In his black notebooks, he's very explicit about his support for National Socialism and for Hitler, and very explicit about agreeing with the Nazis' take on Jews. So Heidegger's not some innocent man who was co-opted by an evil regime, and he had to toe the line to stay alive. He was an active participant and player in that whole scheme.
And he co-opted some Japanese philosophy to help him do it.
He did. And it just demonstrates, and isn't it ironic, that in the same manner in Heidegger's country, that his philosophy was probably in certain aspects a propaganda tool to strengthen the belief in National Socialism in Germany, in the destiny of German philosophy. The tea ceremony in Japan was co-opted with equal connection to an imperial martial tradition, a totalitarian regime. I find the similarities interesting. How connected they are directly, I can't say definitively today, but I find it interesting, that connection.
I don't recall when I was at the tea symposium that they made any references or comments to the martial sort of associations with World War II and the imperial situation with their school of tea. So that would, I'm going on 10-year-old memories here, but I don't recall that. So I'm going to assume that if that's the case, it's not so much as an atonement as maybe a whitewashing, but I don't want to put words in this tea family's mouth. And
right.
So, you know, I mean them no ill will, and I mean them no insult. So I'm not going to give an, you know, I'm obviously not going to say one way. I don't have enough information to actually know what their motivation is.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the tea symposium itself was very positive, obviously, because they're all talking about how they, you know, Korea, Japan, China, you know, making peace with tea. That was kind of the whole theme. And there was a lot of different speakers. And so it was a positive, interesting experience. But yeah, I don't think I recall actually them ever mentioning anything about how they actually were supporting the imperial government during World War II.
And their support may have been indirect. I mean, the tea ceremony, from what I've read, is supposed to really humble you. It's supposed to be very peaceful. When you're in the tea room, I think even enemies who have tea together in the tea room are forbidden in any way to bring their conflict in with them. It's really all about peacefully sharing a cup of tea, and it's about the host. I may be wrong about this, but my impression is the host in the tea ceremony is acting the part of the bodhisattva. Because the tea ceremony is arranged such that everything is built and designed for the comfort and for the pleasure of the guest, not the host. So the master of ceremonies in the tea ceremony, even how he, nowadays, it's women, many women, how she pours the tea, it's not in such an angle that it's more comfortable for the master to pour the tea. It's so that the tea is being poured in a way that's most comfortable for the arrangement of the guest while it's being poured.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because back in '94 when I was in college in Japan, I took a 6-month class in the tea ceremony, and I immediately, like, first day, I realized one specific thing, and is that it's very similar in concept to the martial arts kata, because everything that you do is scripted, from walking to the tea set, to folding the napkins, to pouring the tea, to drinking the tea, to handing out the whatever it was, these little candies.
Yeah, the candies that go with the tea.
The whole process from start to finish is very scripted. It's scripted the way a kata is scripted. You do it identical, the same every single time. Your first step is with your left foot or your right. I don't remember. I just remember the stern teacher of tea berating us because we would step off with the wrong foot, and she'd be like, left, right, left, right, left, right. How many times do I have to tell you? And I mean, I swear, if she had a ruler, she would have smacked us. She was a stern teacher of tea. But yeah, the whole process, not only as the preparer of the tea, but also as the drinker of the tea, it's a very specific process. You turn the bowl clockwise 3 times and bring it to your lips, and all of these very specific things. And I thought it was really fascinating, and I was really interested in it, but a few other people who were in there were not interested. Maybe a couple Canadians that I can recall off the top of my head. But it really seemed like a kata. So I basically went through it as though it were a kata, because where you set the tea utensils down, if you think of the bowl as a clock, you put this down at like 10 o'clock, or you put it down at 2 o'clock, and everything is very specific, very scripted. And then another thing too, which never occurred to me until I started reading up on the tea ceremony, is at least what we were doing was always matcha, always powdered tea. We never used tea leaves, ever. Which I don't know why. That never occurred to me to ask.
The Song dynasty, I think their tea drinking was the whipped variety of tea. It was the powdered tea. And of course then the Song dynasty was obliterated by the Mongols, whose fleet were destroyed by the divine wind. And so when, what did you say his name was? The monk returned? Asai. With the tea ceremony, along with the additional sutras, he brought back the method of powdered tea drinking. Matcha? Is that what you called it?
Yeah, it's matcha.
He brought that back with him from Song dynasty in China before the development of brewing and steeping leaves of tea. So the ceremony itself was built on, the second time it was revived in Japan, was built on the Song dynasty's drinking of tea.
Interesting. And I've been to tea houses in Japan, which is a really interesting thing, where you're in a room, you're served tea, and the back wall is usually open, overlooking a Zen garden, and you just kind of meditate and drink tea. Really, it's pretty fascinating that such places exist in Japan.
Well, and isn't it kind of like a Zen garden when you're in the tea room? even the arrangement of the calligraphy, the pieces
Oh,
that
that's right. They have
are
the
placed, the aesthetic value,
they have
visual aesthetics.
Yeah, what's it called? Kakejiku, I think it's called. I could be stupidly wrong here, but I think it's called Kakejiku, which is basically the spot in the tea room where they have the hanging scroll. Because
Yeah.
I do remember that from the tea ceremony. I don't remember what part that played in the tea ceremony. I don't remember if that was just sort of ambiance or if you actually made any references to it. But anyway, I mean, it's been a long time since I've done that. But
It's supposed to put you into a meditative mindset, isn't it? If you're the guest, I don't know if you're the master, the tea master. You're probably in a meditative state anyway, because it's a kind of an active meditation when you're pouring the tea and the way you're arranging all these different things. You're really in a state of flow,
Yeah.
of active meditation, like walking meditation.
although it's interesting because there is that aspect, but then there's also the golfing aspect where, they get together and basically they're talking shop. They're drinking tea, talking shop as part of the tea ceremony. They're being served tea while they're negotiating or what have you, rather than the deep philosophical contemplation.
Are there things you're allowed to talk about or not allowed to talk about in that setting? Is there anything that's off limits?
I have no idea. I don't know.
Because I don't know that either. Like, are you allowed? Because I know in certain cases where I guess I've seen references, allusions to it, where enemies come to the tea house and they drink the tea together with the tea master.
And when you drink the tea, once you've drunk the tea, it's forbidden to harm the guest or something.
Something like that.
Until the rains of Castamere starts blowing.
I don't know. I think probably if you're with the wrong tea master in the West Country of Westeros, the tea would be poisoned and you'd never get out alive.
But, well, see, I think it's interesting because on the one hand, you have, the tea ceremony, all of this deep, everything's very scripted and
It's ideals.
philosophical. But then you also have, like, for example, Hideyoshi's Grand Kitano tea ceremony in 1587.
Yes.
Which seemed like a circus to me. It's from what I was reading, it seems very different than the concept of, like, the austere tea room. So
Didn't he accuse his primary tea, what was his name?
Sen no Rikyu.
Sen no Rikyu of treason.
Yeah, that's sort of a complex point because we don't know 100% the reasons behind it. There's a few solid theories, though. But as far as the Grand Kitano's tea ceremony is concerned, it was a massive tea ceremony held by Hideyoshi. Apparently, there were over 1,000 people at the Kitano Tenjin Shrine in Kyoto. Basically, it was organized by Hideyoshi to show off the priceless tea wares that he'd collected as he unified his way across the country and all that. So pretty much, I guess there was... people were invited regardless of their rank. So out of these thousands of people, there were probably people who varied widely in rank. And apparently, and I found this interesting, is that tea masters they weren't invited; they were mandated to attend.
Ooh.
And if they didn't attend, they were no longer allowed to serve tea. And if they did serve tea to anyone they served tea to would be blackballed.
Wow.
So I found, or blacklisted, whatever the term is. But I found
that's right. Yeah, blacklist.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it was supposed to last 10 full days, but Hideyoshi called it off after the first day. Apparently, he served over 800 people tea, and then from that point onward, only hosted small private events. So for whatever reason, but at this point in Hideyoshi's life, he was getting a little bonkers, so that might have something to do with it. But, a side note, I actually went to the site of the Kitano tea ceremony, and this was back in the days before cell phone cameras and all that. I think it was might have been 98. I don't remember exactly, but one thing I do remember is I stood in front of the raised platform that Hideyoshi would have been sitting on. I kind of looked out, and I had my camera with me, which is just a regular film camera, and I snapped a photo. And the reason this is important is because there were signs everywhere saying, photography is forbidden. But I'm like, I'm gonna sneakily take a photo here because this is the location of the Grand Kitano tea ceremony, and this is Hideyoshi's view. This is where he was sitting, so this is awesome. So first I took a picture of the view, which was cool. But then when I turned it around to take a picture of the sort of the raised area, it was darker and it set off my flash. And like monks all over the place were like, they were like pointing and they're like, da, 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 da. I don't remember what they were saying. And I was just like, oh, sorry, accidentally hit the button, no big deal. And I just hurriedly kind of rushed out of there before the monks could get me. But I did end up with a photo of it, so that was kind of cool. But one thing I did notice is the area was very crowded and not that large. So I'm wondering if they put up some walls and put in some trees and various things over the past 500 years that really changed the scenery. Because it was a lot. I mean, it's not the area that would really fit 1,000 people from what I can remember. It's been a long time though. God, what?
Well, what's interesting is they wouldn't have preserved that monument exactly as it was in the day, because the tea house and any dwelling place or a place where you are active in some manner or other, its purpose is to serve you. And it's a reflection of your needs, not of its purpose. So these things are modular and they can be torn down and changed. I don't think it's not the same as when we preserve a museum or we preserve Paul Revere's house or something. It has to be exactly the way it was in Paul Revere's day. It can be changed according to the needs of the owner, to the purpose of the owner, right? Kokuzo was talking about some of this in later chapters in the Book of Tea, how even the structures are meant to serve the person at the moment, and they're not meant to last. They're not meant to be preserved. And that must be a Zen concept, because it's impermanence. Everything is impermanence and change and relative. So they probably wouldn't have preserved that place as it was in Hideyoshi's day.
Well, also it's been 500 years. So
sure, it's been 500 years.
It would have changed over and over.
Of course, but what I mean is they would have made little to no effort to really preserve it.
Yeah, I think they probably moved walls around and this and that, so it's very different. I mean, if I remember correctly, and again, I'm going by a 19-year-old memory,
right?
But I think the distance from the platform area where Hideyoshi would have been sitting was probably less than 40 feet from the wall. So, I mean, it's a big area, but I just remember there were lots of walls and trees, and you kind of had to like walk on platforms to get around. I vaguely remember that. And again, if any listeners have been there more recently, maybe you can correct me and give me some more useful information, because again, I'm just going off some old memories here. And although, you know, it's interesting, I just kind of remembered this, but if we really wanted to further present damning evidence against this, the Sen family, the Grand Kitano tea ceremony was actually reproduced on its 350th anniversary in honor of the Showa Emperor in 1936.
Ooh.
And it was, again, on the 350th anniversary of the death of Sen no Rikyu in 1940. And I don't know where they did this. I kind of doubt they did this at the same location. Maybe they did, I don't know. But, you know, again, this was on behalf of the emperor, essentially during wartime. So, you know, again, you kind of see the support for the wartime government by the practitioners of the tea ceremony, at least in this case.
The enthusiastic support, yes.
Yeah.
On the eve of the attack on Pearl Harbor, essentially, less than a year. About a year.
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't remember. I don't know the date in 1940, but about a year to a year and a half before Pearl Harbor. Yeah.
Interesting. Something that seems so innocuous and so peaceful as a tea ceremony, as etiquette, because in effect what it is, especially in modern Japan now, for women, it's the acquisition of skills of etiquette. I guess it used to be up until the early 20th century that mostly men drank and participated in the tea ceremony, and now it's mostly women, primarily. Is that right?
Could be. I remember all of the people who were helping the tea teacher, or whatever the technical term is for her, were all girls. But then again, I went to a university in Japan that at the time was about 95% female. So, so that's not saying much.
Okay. Interesting. Something you might think of as harmless, effectively, or that concept, that idea, there's no harm in that. It doesn't mean anything negative. It's interesting how, and this is a bigger question, encompasses East and West. It doesn't matter where we come from. Something that we think is relatively benign or even beneficial, a concept in philosophy or a ceremony, can actually be co-opted for something straight up evil. That fascinates me too, on a broader topic. Just the capacity for human evil from a seemingly beneficial or positive source. That interests me. That things can be co-opted and taken in a different direction that seems contrary. I really can't elaborate much further. Just I saw, the more I read in the Book of Tea, the more of direct connection I saw. Just concepts and ideas. I just saw more and more of them the more deeply I looked into the Book of Tea. And it's made me question just how much of it did he take. He took more than the term.
You mean Heidegger?
Yeah, he took more than the idea of being in the world from where you're connected to. And that's a whole phenomenological discussion that is out of place for us today, maybe. But the more deeply I read, the more it felt like he took liberally and often from the Book of Tea. Not just a little, but a lot.
And then it's, like you said before too, it's interesting that his support for the Nazi government, in a way, kind of reflected the support that the tea masters gave the imperial government in Japan.
I feel like there's a kind of like is to like as this is to this. One of those kind of problems where you could compare the support that his thought may have given to World War II in Germany on a similar path as to the tea ceremony being an outlet or a tool of propaganda for the empire, for militarism. There seems to be a real like is to like connection between the two. And that's even more interesting to me. Because then you study the depths of, well, okay, did Heidegger take from this thinker without attributing to him? Okay, he did. Well, what does it mean? That he drew from a tradition that across the world, another one of the Axis powers was serving a similar role.
Well, here's an interesting thought that I just had. And as you are a philosopher, as you are a doctor of philosophy.
A doctor of philosophy. I won't call myself a philosopher.
Well, here's an interesting thought for you. Maybe you can shed light on this, maybe not. But what is it with these sort of sacraments or these tying of ritual to something, kind of the way that the ritual of tea was tied to and supported the imperial government, and how the same concepts, even though it wasn't an actual ritual, but the same concepts that supported the government in Japan also was used by Heidegger to support the Nazis. I mean, what is it with this actual ritual and this? Is this sort of like a physical way to get people to buy into your beliefs, or what?
I think it's when you're dealing with a ritual, a sacrament, you're dealing with a ritual that it's doing several things for you, isn't it? It's drawing you closer to your fellow members of your community, and it's drawing you closer. I suppose the Christian sacrament, it's drawing you closer to Christ, closer to the church. The tea,
drawing you closer to the emperor.
Drawing you closer to the emperor, because the emperor is a deity, is a Shinto deity.
Well, that's a good point. Yeah.
Okay, so and your nation, the nation is a kind of entity. It's a form of idolatry. The nation is a false god in a way, and you're bowing down to your nation. You're elevating the ideals of your nation, and you're worshiping that nation. But you're doing that. That's too abstract for most of us. So we need rituals, and we need to feel communally bound to our nation. And so you would share a ritual to do this, to connect members of your community together in one purpose. Well, our purpose is to support the nation in its endeavors and to send our sons and daughters to fight, or whatever it is. And with the case of philosophy, the nation needs an ideology. A nation needs a justification for its conquests. It needs a rationalization for its existence. It needs a way to define itself to itself, because a nation is made up of human beings, but a nation is an abstraction. There isn't America out there in the ether or existent. It's in you and me. What we think of as democracy, what we think of as our nation's support of freedom, our ideals, etc. A nation is along the same lines as a god, and you have these rituals, or you have a philosophy that binds the nation together, that ideals that justify why is this nation better than others, why is it more worthy than others. So I think there again, there's a direct corollary. The philosophical aspect, the propaganda aspect of it, more abstractly, it's uniting a community against another. Tea ceremony, propaganda, instrument of propaganda, the dispensing of the ideals of this nation, within the nation, peace, communal harmony, obey, and without, our enemies need to be annihilated, right? In the name of our God, which is by turns the emperor, who is a Shinto deity, the nation state, which is a sort of an artificial god of sorts. And there must always be rituals in any religion, and there must always be sacraments. So I guess the question becomes, what is the object of worship? And I understand that in imperial Japan, Shinto was appropriated, so was Buddhism and Zen. And for the same reasons Christians were persecuted in ancient Rome, they were equally persecuted in imperial Japan, because they put Jesus Christ above any worldly pursuits. And so their God is a God that's untouchable or unreachable by the nation state. I mean, it opens up a whole cascade, almost a concatenation of questions that all circle around what is our definition, what's our community, what's our purpose. So there's a direct tie-in between these rituals and supporting a nation, supporting its ideals.
Yeah, I was just sort of thinking, like, I wonder what is it with people and their rituals. But I mean, if you really think about it, it does make sense.
We need to be defined. We need to be defined by others, but we also need to feel like we have a role in defining ourselves. So even though these rituals, right, they're all choreographed, they're all planned out, you're not going to have an original thought to yourself unless you're very independent-minded and strong-willed. It's a ready-made self-definition, and it's easier for most of us, most of the time. Even those of us who think we're intelligent and free-thinking, it's always going to be the case that it's easier for us to accept somebody else's definition than to create and forge our own as individuals, as individual humans. So what's even more intriguing is that Zen is nothing if not very individualistic. I mean, they know, they've memorized the sutras. They can rattle them off as well as any monk who chants them every day. But in a Zen monastery, they don't. They don't chant the sutras. And there are Zen parables that talk about, the sutras are waste paper, right? I mean, these are the Buddhist sutras. And there's one where they're talking about a Zen monk burning a statue of the Buddha, a wooden statue, because he's cold. He needed to be warm. Well, it's wood. I'm cold. It's going to be burned. So there's isn't there a strong tendency of individualism and practicality in Zen, and also a revolutionary quality about it?
That's kind of what I got out of it when I was obsessed with it in high school. Kind of like a typical pseudo-philosopher.
Yeah.
Age 17 or so.
And it's not about doing what you want. These people know the sutras and the scriptures as well as, if not better than, other monasteries. And so they're not bound by it because they see past it. They go past it, where they realize we don't need the outer trappings, the framework. We don't need this crutch anymore. We can be purely in our hearts, in the moment, living in the moment. And we don't have to chant the scriptures every day to be closer to the Buddha nature of all people and all things around us. And so I find it it's almost a sad statement about the human condition that something so revolutionary and individualistic that you would think would be a bastion of resistance against a totalitarian regime was the very instrument that strengthened that totalitarian regime over its people. Now, isn't that interesting?
That's deep.
Isn't that a dichotomy?
Okay, that's it for this episode. Be sure to check out patreon.com/samuraiarchives to see how you can help and all the cool bonuses you can grab. Also check out samuraipodcast.com for all things related to this podcast, and hey, maybe even go to iTunes and give us a favorable review. See you next time.